Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Philly Factor. I'm your host, Paul Perrello. Well, it's no surprise when I say nature is all around us, that nature is indeed all around us, all around us. I mean, sometimes people don't necessarily think that we're surrounded by nature. We look out the window, we see grass, we may see a squirrel, we may see a sparrow. That may be our extent of our experience with nature. But then again, depending where you live, your experience with nature may be much more intense than just the squirrel and the occasional sparrow or pigeon that flies around the neighborhood. Well, Exploring Philly Nature is a new book that is being released. Exploring Philly Nature, a guide for all four seasons. It is by Bernard Brown. He likes to be referred to as Billy. So, Billy, welcome to the program. Appreciate your time and congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think it's safe to say, like I just mentioned at the outset of the program, that we are surrounded by nature. We take nature for granted on so many different levels. But I remember as a young kid, seeing a sparrow outside my house or that occasional pigeon was kind of exciting. And then when I grew up and my parents moved from one part of South Philly down to another part of South Philly, and we saw the occasional cardinal or blue jay, I was like, wow, this is fantastic. I had only moved like 6 or 7 or maybe 8 blocks, but the sparrow was still there. But then we saw these other, what I thought were exotic birds in my neighborhood. But I really had a tremendous appreciation of nature. And now in that same neighborhood today, Billy, it's not just sparrows, pigeons, blue jays, and cardinals, but we have seen possums. We've seen raccoons. We have seen deer. I live down near FDR Park, really in South Philadelphia. So this is sort of another eye-opening experience for us, because when I was growing up, we were lucky if we saw a bunny. We were lucky. But that's why I like your book so much, because it really allows us to explore Philadelphia nature. And sometimes we don't necessarily think of deer and raccoons and rabbits in Philadelphia because we're city folk. We're not supposed to see those things. But you would disagree, according to your book.
I would certainly disagree, and I think because I think I thought this way also up until a few years ago. I think we all sort of come in with this idea that nature, wildlife, the wilds, however you want to think of it, is somewhere out there, right? It's in parks, it's in places that have trailheads and stuff like that. And I think we do ourselves a disservice. It's sort of, in a way, you can see and experience the things that you're prepared to see and experience. If what you're ready for when you walk out of the door is just to see cars and sidewalks, then that in a way is how those are your blinders as you're walking around in your daily routines. I think when you sort of start accepting other spaces, what we have traditionally thought of as urban spaces, as spaces for wildlife, spaces for plants, spaces for animals, then I think you're ready to spot that blue jay or that cardinal like you're talking about. And I think you have a story there that is really common, which is that when we're kids, I don't know if I get into this so much in the book, but when you're kids, you don't come into it necessarily with those preconceived ideas of where you find wonder in your life, right? Mm-hmm. And so for a little kid, you can step outside and see, and sparrows are fascinating to watch, even though we almost everybody, including myself, a lot of the time, we take them for granted. But then when you're not there yet, you can still find them exciting. And I hope that through the stuff we talk about in the book, that we can sort of reset how people look at the world around us.
Yeah, I want to get into the book here in a moment, but for this kid at the age of 64, I got excited recently when I saw 2 ducks walking down the street, and I was like, these ducks are definitely lost. They do not, and I found myself following them. I kept my distance because I knew I wasn't going to get close, but I was like, we don't see mallards walking down 18th Street in South Philadelphia. Now, as I said, we're close to FDR Park, so it's not uncommon that these type of birds or this type of animal would migrate to the park. But just waddling down 18th Street, I'm like, this. If you would have told me this as a kid, I would never believe it, because that was not something that we expect. Now, I understand that their habitats have changed and we've encroached on their habitats, but and that is a whole other conversation for another time. But in your book, you really have embraced this idea of all four seasons in Philadelphia bring a different landscape when it comes to wildlife that migrates in and out of our area. As the seasons change, so do the occupants of Mother Nature.
They do, and I think your duck example is a fun one right there. With cities, birding and sort of observing birds is one of the best gateways into just observing the wild and observing nature in general. And this is something we can get into more, but because birds can fly, which
Mm-hmm.
seems so obvious, but one of the great barriers to animals moving around the city space is the streets. And so, like a deer, like you mentioned, or a possum or a raccoon, they're going to be somewhat limited by just being able to cross a road and not get hit, right? Whereas birds, they still end up getting hit by cars sometimes, but they're much more flexible with that kind of thing. They can fly over the roads. And so when we talk about seasonal changes in what wild neighbors we're sharing Philadelphia with, birds are a really great place to start. And you're noting that you live near FDR Park. When we're talking about things like ducks, and use the generic term waterfowl for birds that tend to swim or float on the water, and the lakes, as people call them in FDR Park,
Yep.
are a great spot for seeing all kinds of birds, ducks, things called coots, which are also these sort of black birds that swim around the water and act kind of like ducks, even though they're not ducks. But these are birds that breed somewhere else, right? For the most part. And we mentioned mallards. Mallards are resident all year round in Philadelphia, but there are also other mallards that migrate from other places. And then you got a whole long list of other kinds of ducks and whatnot that come from Canada, come from the Great Plains. And then as water freezes up where they start off, they head south to find other places to swim around and to eat. And so, they'll end up in our rivers, they'll end up in our ponds, they'll end up in the lakes in FDR Park. And I think this is a great example of how, in ways that you might not realize right away, our city isn't a bubble. It isn't like we've got walls around Philadelphia that cuts it off from the rest of the continent, the rest of the hemisphere even. We have a lot of birds, and we can get into it with fish also. We have a lot of birds that spend part of the year here and part of the year other places that we might not even think of as being part of the same systems as we are in, right? So we have various kinds of ducks that might be coming from Alberta, who knows? And then, pretty much anywhere in Philadelphia, you can look up and see a kind of a bird called a chimney swift in the summer, which have this kind of twittering call that you can pick up sometimes if you're walking around, and you see them flying around like little boomerangs flying around over the rooftops. And they fly around picking bugs out of the air, and like the name implies, they like to build their nests in chimneys, and those spend the winter in South America. And so right there, we've got another case of another bird that sort of connects Philadelphia to places really far away, and I think can give us a little bit of the sort of tangible experience of this kind of connectedness. I could go on forever with examples of that.
Yeah. One bird that has seemed to relocate, and I remember, many years ago when we would see, Canadian geese, they have sort of taken over. No matter where you go, they're on the lawn on the side of the road. And again, being from South Philadelphia, it's not uncommon to see them on, the DRPA property as you come off the Walt Whitman Bridge. And we're not just talking 1, 2, 3, but just drive down Packer Avenue, and you're literally seeing a flock of Canadian geese. And I remember, as a youngster, being told, well, they're migrating from Canada down south. But
Sure.
something makes me seem like it seems to me that they like it here because it seems like they're here all year round.
Well, they are, and this is an actual. There's a interesting human history to this. And so Canada geese, like you're talking about, have migrated for as long as there have been Canada geese, right?
Hmm.
And so if we rewound the clock about a century, the way that Philadelphians would experience Canada geese would be they would be flying over from Canada down south of Philadelphia, probably, but maybe stopping on their way down and on their way back. And you would see and hear these flocks flying overhead. I mean, just the past few days, I've been noticing this, where you hear the noise a little bit when you're walking on the sidewalk and you look up and you see these great V's, or V's kind of stuck together of hundreds of geese flying overhead. But what happened is they were such popular game birds, people hunting them, that we didn't completely wipe them out, but we came really close. And so then what happened is state game agencies like the PA Game Commission started stocking Canada geese in sort of wildlife management areas and state game lands, and they basically clipped their wings so they couldn't fly, and so you had like a generation of them stuck where we put them, and then successive generations never relearned how to migrate. And so what we have today are the descendants of those birds that mostly stick around. Plus, we have the ones passing through from Canada on south and back. And so with Canada geese, it's a funny thing that they love cities because they like having relatively short grass to eat. And then in a city, we've got our foxes. We're starting to have more coyotes. But really, there's not as much predators in Philadelphia as you might find further out in the countryside somewhere. And then there's not really much hunting in Philadelphia. No one's blasting away at them with shotguns.
Sure.
And so we've sort of created in our cities this perfect place for these resident geese. And it's sort of a funny story of how our actions have these sort of ripple effects. And in a way, these geese are urbanites too. And it's a part of the story that I hope people come away with, is that a lot of the animals that we see and share space with in cities aren't just wandering in from somewhere more that we think of as more wild, but they were born and bred here for several generations and are sort of city goers as well.
Your book is not only broken down chapter by chapter, but it's also season by season. And your first chapter is called Go Birds, watching bald eagles nesting. And I never really thought of our area as being a nesting area for the bald eagle. I know they're endangered. Well, they were on the endangered list. They were taken off. Yeah.
They're a great success story that way.
It is, but why? I mean, I'm surprised to find out that the bald eagle is actually nesting in our area.
Certainly, yeah. And it's what made them endangered. It's a combination of people shooting them for fun. People probably this part I'm guessing a little bit because it happens with other birds, but shooting them out of perceived competition for fish. But then the big thing was a pesticide called DDT. That's sort of famous in environmental history. What it does is it kills bugs, but then it sort of gets there's a term for this, bioaccumulation. When you move up a food chain, and maybe there's a little bit of DDT in bugs that are in the water that get eaten by fish, and then there's more in those fish, and then as you go up the food chain, it gets more and more concentrated. So that when you get to birds like bald eagles or peregrine falcons, or osprey, these are all birds of prey which would have higher levels sort of at the top of the food chain of DDT. And what it did is it weakened their eggshells so that when the parents would sit on the eggs in the nest, they would actually crush the eggs. And so once DDT was taken out, and once we had restrictions on against just shooting bald eagles, they were able to bounce back. And I think Philly has probably we've got these big rivers, right? We've got the Delaware River, we've got the Schuylkill River, and they're full of fish. And bald eagles, if they can find a big enough tree to build a nest in, and have a place to catch fish, that's what they need. So we have them nesting some of the most prominent ones are at the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge at Tinicum. They are near this place called Fort Mifflin on the Delaware.
Sure.
You've got some on Petty's Island, which is sort of in between Northeast Philly and New Jersey. And so we've got them scattered around. I see them around Cobb's Creek at the edge of West Philly, where I am a lot. And I remember once I was just in a park in the middle of West Philly, Malcolm X Park, and I looked up and there was a bald eagle flying overhead.
Wow.
And it's one of these things that I am old enough, I'm guessing you are too, that we grew up when they weren't all that common yet.
Sure.
And so I still get excited when I see them. And it's something that I find that I have friends who are much more into birding than I am, and they sort of get used to them seeing all the time. But I get really excited when I see them because I remember when they weren't everywhere, and they're just spectacular birds to look at. And so if you go to Pennypack on the Delaware, another great place to look at them, where they nest, and you can they just have massive beaks and massive talons, and you can see why we picked them as our national bird.
Yeah, and like you said, you can't miss them because their wingspan is quite large, and so when you see one flying overhead, chances are it's not a pigeon, it's not a sparrow, it's
Sure.
yeah. But you also mentioned the falcons, and I know that there have been nesting areas around City Hall where some of the peregrine falcons have actually, and they put cameras there at one time where people could go online and actually see these birds actually be born. But that was a big thing too when we sort of found out that City Hall was like sort of a nesting place for these
Certainly.
falcons.
Yeah, and I think the city's done a good job of highlighting the birds there. You can pretty much every year, a biologist from the state game commission comes in and puts identifying bands basically around the ankles of the nestlings, and so that's like an event, makes it a media event to sort of point out that they're there. There's some in Manayunk, St. John the Baptist Church.
Mm-hmm.
They pop up at other places. There's a pair that's been trying to nest in St. Cyprian's Catholic Church in West Philadelphia. They like those tall bell towers, right?
Sure.
And so peregrines are just some of the most spectacular birds anywhere. They hit over 200 miles per hour when they dive to try to catch another bird. They mainly eat birds. And so their hunting technique is to get high and then dive at a really steep, fast dive and just knock them out of whatever they're hunting, duck, pigeon, just knock them out of the sky. And they just have this very impressive kind of like martial look to them. Like there's just kind of fierce birds. And they ended up in cities because back in the day, they were also devastated by DDT. And when they started reintroducing them, the biologists and state agencies that were doing this, they started off putting them in sort of some of the more traditional places they had lived, maybe around marshes or around the Susquehanna River and some of the cliffs over the river there. And they didn't do so great. And then someone, I don't know exactly who thought of this, but someone realized that these birds, which like to nest on cliffs, might do great in cities, which are basically with skyscrapers and large buildings, a whole bunch of artificial cliffs, and an environment full of pigeons, which are just the right size food for these falcons. And so they have taken to it. And so they now on their own, they pick out nesting spots in cities. And so I'll be walking around Center City, and once you see a few of them, once you know what to listen for their call, then you'll just be walking around, you'll hear them, and you look up, and there it is.
Wow.
I've been at let's say, sometimes if you get a chance, people who live in Center City might have a pole on the roof of their apartment building or something like that. And if you're up there, you can. I've seen them in those situations. So they're this great success story. And the one I highlight in the book is that there's a restaurant, a Couch Tomato, which is sort of in a perfect viewing spot in Manayunk, so that you can have lunch or dinner outside, and be able to watch the falcons that are nesting around St. John the Baptist, and do it in, again, thoroughly urban setting, right? You're Manayunk. This is not a place with big lawns, right? This is row houses built right up against the sidewalk on a steep street, but right there you've got one of the most spectacular animals in the world that you can watch right there.
Um, we've been talking about a lot of exotic animals, just for the lack of a better term, but
Yeah.
things that catch our
Charismatic
attention.
is a term we use a lot. Yeah.
What's the term?
Charismatic.
Charismatic. But we can't forget some of the smaller um, neighbors in our environment, and
Yeah.
oftentimes we sort of are freaked out by spiders and flies and ants and ladybugs and all these creepy crawler type things. But that's part of nature that we're surrounded by.
Certainly. And I think I was mentioning before that one of the, birds give us a lot of like sort of a window into the natural world because they can get around a city without getting run over. The same is true for a lot of insects and spiders. Spiders, when they are little babies, they sometimes get around by what's called ballooning, where they put up a little thread of silk and the wind blows them somewhere else. And that's how they get from one area to another. And then any insect with wings can get around. A lot of the other critters that little critters that we see, get transported when we move potted plants around and things like that. And so, a study, getting an appreciation for what we'll call them invertebrates in general, is another way to sort of open up a window into the natural world. And that can be, I talk about this in your basement. I think I'm going to guess most of the people who are hearing this are not excited when they run into a house centipede, running out from behind their dryer in their basement or something like that. But if you can if you can look at them a few times and hopefully get over the initial creepy crawly reaction, you can have a chance to observe some really neat stuff. And we've got a few species like long-legged cellar spiders. A lot of these spiders don't have the best concise names. It's sort of very descriptive, but they don't roll off the tongue. There's a bunch of these little spiders. I've seen a few kinds of jumping spiders in my house. And there's the ones that I think would be hard to argue are not pests, like cockroaches and things like that, which have their own interesting natural history, but I don't really want them in my kitchen. I doubt you do either.
Sure. Yeah.
But then you have a whole bunch of ones that I would say range from being totally like innocuous, like they don't harm you anyway, they don't really help you anyway, they're just kind of there. And then you have the ones, I'll take the house centipede, which is a predator that runs down cockroaches and other things you might not want in your house and eats them. And that this is I think a way of pointing out that you don't even have to leave your house to start, sort of a study of ecology and of biodiversity. You can start in your basement. You can start, I'm thinking right now in my head, our pantry, underneath the shelf with all the cereal and everything, there are some little spider webs. And so every now and then, we clean them out sometimes, but every now and then I look under there and I can see the little spiders under there. I'm like, hey guys, sort of our housemates that have their own interesting life history.
Yeah. We just have a few minutes left, and we can go on and speak for another half hour. But I know you end the book by talking about what we can do, because sort of that human reaction to seeing a spider or a fly or whatever is to swat it away, to get rid of it. I don't want it in my house. But what can we do to sort of help Mother Nature and all our friends that are around us?
Sure, it's a great question, and it's something that there definitely are some concrete things we could do. I think some things I'll mention some things we can't do, but I if someone's got ideas, then that's great stuff to follow up on. Is how do you deal with just the inherent nature of a city with all the roads and things like that? We might be stuck with those limitations for different kinds of animals moving around the city. What we can do is be conscious of how we green our spaces that we have access to. You'll see a lot of discussion of using native plants in your garden to the extent that you can. What that means is plants that are from around here, because a lot of the bugs that are from around here know how to eat them. Now, It means you might have to deal with a few more bugs eating your plants, which is could be a downside, but that means that those bugs are there for everything up the food chain that wants to do that. Limiting your pesticide use, I think maybe there are good times to pull out a weed killer, and we could talk for hours about when those times might be, but the less you can, the better, because that's more chemicals that are not floating around killing other things. Not using rat poisons and thinking of other ways to control rodents helps hawks that might eat those rats. I talk about how we can people who are cat owners have the opportunity to limit what their cats end up eating outside by going outside with your cat. I know it might sound crazy to some people, but I have a lot of friends who take their cats out on leashes. And that's one thing you can do. With birds, a big problem birds have in cities is running into windows because they just don't understand that the reflection of a tree is not actually a tree. And so there are things you can do to make your windows more visible. So these are concrete steps we can take that make the spaces we have control over in our city, our houses, maybe this is your apartment, but places that you can actually control how you make it welcoming to other species around us, and in ways that really don't hurt you at all, but might help make your neighborhood a little more biodiverse and give everybody there a little more experience of the wild and of nature where you are.
Well, fascinating book. Again, it's called Exploring Philly Nature. It is by Bernard Billy Brown. Exploring Philly Nature, a guide for all four seasons. And I want to thank you, Billy, for being with us here on the program. As I said, we could have you back and go into each season of the year and discuss what it is that we might be looking at and what we might be experiencing. But congratulations on the book, continued success, and thanks so much for being with us on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, until the next time, thanks so much for being with us here on the Philly Factor. I'm Paul Perrello. Have a great day.